I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Donald Trump and Xi Jinping meet in South Korea, we ask whether Ukraine can ever expect China to face real consequences for its support of Russia throughout the war. Then, we examine Vladimir Putin's ongoing air campaign to cripple Ukraine's energy infrastructure, including last night's major assault, and bring you the latest stories from inside the Russian Federation, from renewed public protests to fresh signs of deepening economic stagnation.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 30th of October, 3 years and 250 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by Telegraph reporter and producer Adélie Pojzman-Pontay and our former Russia correspondent, James Kilner. But first, the major military-related updates of the last 24 hours. Last night saw another huge air attack against Ukraine, with at least 52 cruise and ballistic missiles alongside 653 Shahed drones. In full, the Air Force claims to have shot down 592 enemy UAVs, 21 Kh-101 cruise missiles, 7 Kalibr cruise missiles, 1 Iskander-K cruise missile, and 2 Kh-59, Kh-69 guided air-to-surface missiles. I list them there just to underscore the myriad of weapons systems Ukraine has to contend with during these attacks. In Lviv Oblast in western Ukraine, 2 energy infrastructure facilities were damaged. In Zaporizhia Oblast in southeastern Ukraine, residential buildings were hit. The governor there reported 2 people were killed and 23 others, including 6 children, were injured. In Vinnytsia Oblast in central Ukraine, a 7-year-old girl was killed and 4 people were injured. North of the capital, in Kyiv Oblast, a 36-year-old woman was also injured. Local officials reported that a fire broke out in a home and that residential buildings were damaged. In Mykolaiv Oblast, in southern Ukraine, Russian attacks caused power outages. Incredibly, Ukrainian railways published an apology, saying that some passenger trains were running with minor delays. It seems the major target was Ukraine's critical energy infrastructure. As a brilliant piece in Tomorrow's Affairs summarises, for the 4th winter in a row, Russia seeks to plunge Ukraine into darkness and cold. Quote, many in energy circles are worried that this winter will be the most difficult since 2022, when the Russian army literally destroyed major power generation facilities in Ukraine. The piece then goes on to quote Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko. Today, we face the challenge of getting through the most difficult heating season since the start of the full-scale war, as the enemy is ferociously and systematically attacking all energy and heat generation facilities at once, with large-scale drone and missile strikes aimed at destroying and dismantling critical infrastructure. As a reminder, at least 2 transformer substations have already been struck in Kharkiv this autumn, and gas extraction facilities have also been heavily hit. As a consequence, about 60% of Ukraine's gas production capacity has been destroyed. In many regions, the start of the heating season has been postponed by 2 weeks, from mid-October to early November. Ukrainians are once again stocking up on power banks, generators and portable Wi-Fi, preparing to spend long hours, even days, in darkness. The mayor of Lviv has urged residents to prepare alternative sources of heat and to support those unable to do so. Since October the 11th, the city has been operating in testing mode. As part of these preparations, even traffic lights were temporarily disconnected from the main grid and switched to backup power to ensure they would keep functioning during a potential blackout. At the same time, as Russia continues to target Ukraine's gas infrastructure, the country now needs roughly €2 billion to secure additional gas imports. Kyiv is covering part of this sum from its own budget and has turned to international partners for support. The big fear is Moscow has learned from its failure last year to completely knock out for sustained periods the energy grid in the major cities like Kyiv. If that happens, the consequences would become very serious very quickly. But turning to the front lines, geolocated footage, mill bloggers and sources on the ground suggest that there have been further Russian advances in Pokrovsk and surrounding areas as Moscow seeks to continue cutting off that city. If you want to hear an overview of the general situation in that sector, which is extremely serious, I would point you to yesterday's episode where I summarised the battle so far and how it's evolved over the past year and a half. President Zelensky once again referenced it in his nightly address, saying the most difficult situation now is in the Pokrovsk direction. The occupiers are trying to gain a foothold by all methods. Every destroyed occupier there is a result for our entire state. He also commented on Kupiansk, southeast of Kharkiv, saying the situation remains difficult there, but these days our forces have more control. I referenced yesterday how there have been multiple reports of Russian advances around Minorad, the city just northeast of Pokrovsk, and Ukraine's East Group of forces have denied claims Moscow's forces have entered that city, rescinding something their own spokesperson had said just a couple of days ago. They now claim they meant Pokrovsk instead. Quote, "The enemy is not in Minorad. The situation in the city and its surroundings is fully controlled by Ukrainian forces." Nonetheless, Putin clearly believes a victory somewhere is imminent, inviting international media, including Ukrainian outlets, to visit thousands of what he calls encircled Ukrainian troops so that Kyiv's leadership can decide their fate, adding that Russia is prepared to suspend military actions for several hours to allow journalists to speak with the troops. It's just this kind of psychological operation we've come to expect from the Kremlin. Now, Adélie will be turning to the significant ramifications of President Trump's visit to Asia shortly. But before that, given the context of Russia's recent nuclear saber-rattling, it's worth reading Trump's latest social media post. Quote, "The US has more nuclear weapons than any other country. This was accomplished, including a complete update and renovation of existing weapons during my first term in office. Because of the tremendous destructive power, I hated to do it, but had no choice. Russia is second and China is a distant third, but will be even within 5 years. Because of other countries' testing programs, I've instructed the Department of War to start testing our own nuclear weapons on an equal basis. That process will begin immediately. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump." Now, just to be factually accurate here, a complete update and renovation of existing weapons did not take place during Trump's first term in office. It wouldn't be possible to do it of all of the thousands of warheads that America has. We don't know the degree to which this is just an attempt to gain leverage in talks with China and Moscow, but suffice to say, if the US really does start testing nuclear weapons again, it'll be a noteworthy development indeed. I think the last time they did so was way back in 1992. For more on the nuclear arms race, I highly recommend the interview we did with Ukrainian historian Serhii Plokhy in Monday's episode. I'll link to that again in the show notes. But just to wrap up, staying with the US, briefly, in an interview yesterday, JD Vance commented on the much more productive relationship between Ukraine and the US since the argument broke out in the Oval Office in February, admitting that his confrontation with Zelensky is probably the most famous thing I've ever done. That's one way of putting it. He also claimed that during Biden's time, whatever Ukraine wanted, we just gave it to them. Now, many of you listening at home will say, if only that were true. I think many would agree that the Biden administration was exceedingly cautious, particularly in the first months of the war. But even later on, it was prohibiting Ukraine from using Western weapons to strike on Russian territory. But those remarks by Vance speak again to fatal misunderstandings as to the true nature of this war and the US's role in it, and the current administration's capabilities, something Europe continues to try to rectify. There are multiple reports of a draft 12-point peace plan for Ukraine, developed by EU partners and Kyiv, doing the rounds. But the different versions I've seen seem to deviate quite substantially. So I think we should be cautious talking about them until we have consistency and clarity. What they have in common is they outline a two-phase process. Ceasefire first and then negotiations, which would include security guarantees and possibly guarantees involving troops on the ground. But that still seems predicated on the idea that a ceasefire is possible to secure without more decisive European action. That remains an open question, whether that is really possible. But we'll be sure to discuss that in more detail in due course. Let's turn to Adélie now then, bringing us up to date with the diplomatic updates. Adélie, where do you want to start?
Thanks, Francis. Well, all eyes this morning are on Busan in South Korea, where Trump and Xi Jinping met for a summit largely focused on the ongoing trade war. According to the US president, the summit was amazing, a 12 out of 10. The US promised to trim tariffs in exchange for Beijing cracking down on the illicit fentanyl trade, resuming US soybean purchases, and keeping rare earths exports flowing. It's a very fragile truce, which brings the US-China relations roughly to where they were before Trump's Liberation Day and the tit-for-tat escalation that has ensued over the last months. For us here, the real question remains, what about Ukraine and what about China's barely covert support for Russia's invasion? Last week, Trump had said he planned to address China's purchases of Russian oil. Quote, "I'd love China to help us out with Russia. We put big sanctions on Russia. I think those sanctions are going to be very biting, very strong, but I'd like to see China help us out." But this morning's headline, I'm afraid, are disappointing in that regard. Although the two men spoke at length on Ukraine, with Trump saying they had discussed working together to see if we can get that war finished, he also added, "We didn't really discuss the oil." As a reminder, over the past decade, revenues from oil and gas have accounted for 30 to 50% of Russia's budget, which is roughly the amount Moscow spent on its all-out war. China remains the biggest importer of Russian oil in the world. From December 2022 until the end of September 2025, China bought 47% of Russia's crude exports. India followed with 38%, and then Turkey and the EU each bought just 6%. Last year, China bought over 100 million tons of Russian crude oil, making up nearly 20% of its total energy imports. A week ago, Trump's sanctions on Russian oil giants Lukoil and Rosneft had led Chinese state oil majors to suspend purchases of seaborne Russian oil, at least in the short term. That leaves us with an open-ended question. Will Trump target Chinese companies buying Russian oil with secondary sanctions? On social media this morning, Trump said that China may also purchase oil and gas from Alaska, which could be another incentive for the American president to push China further on giving up Russian oil. The leaders have two upcoming meetings next year, so we shall have to wait and see. It seems at this stage, any secondary sanctions are unlikely to emerge, just as we predicted. Oh, and Francis, just in case you're wondering what the two presidents said about Taiwan and the security risk in the Pacific, well, Trump said it just never came up.
That is extraordinary. Given all of this talk about the tilt to the Pacific and the prioritising in Washington of Taiwan, the fact that it wasn't even discussed, if that is true, is quite something.
Well, the other major political story this morning is happening closer to home here. The Netherlands woke up to seismic results to its snap elections. To everyone's surprise, centrist Rob Jetten of the D66 party won the election, shattering Eurosceptic Geert Wilders' dreams of being the Netherlands' next prime minister. The two parties are in a real face-off, with 26 seats each in the Dutch House of Representatives and absolutely opposing views. Normally, the largest party gets to form a coalition, and despite very close results, it looks like that ball is now in Jetten's camp. Especially, as Political puts it, as no one mainstream wants to team up with Wilders. If talks fail, others can try, meaning the coming weeks remain unpredictable. The results are nonetheless remarkable, as in 2023, Jetten's D66 only had 9 seats in parliament, and De Wilders and his Party for Freedom had won a shock landslide, the first time a hard-right party won a general election in the Netherlands. Jetten said last night, "We've shown not only to the Netherlands, but also to the world that it's possible to defeat populist and extreme right movements." If he were to become Prime Minister, Jetten would be welcome in Brussels. Political reports that officials in the EU privately welcomed the prospect of the Dutch and their highly regarded diplomats returning to their historic place at the centre of EU affairs after 2 years in which they lost some influence. And that will be crucial in the conversations on Ukraine. Jetten told Euractiv last night that he would back Ukraine no matter what. Quote, "There's a very broad majority in this new chamber to support the Ukrainians no matter what. Because we have to defeat Putin, we will always stand with the Ukrainian people." That's if he can make a government. Now, one last story from me, Francis. Yesterday, the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly called for an end to the US economic embargo on Cuba. There were 165 votes for ending the embargo and 7 against, amongst which the US, obviously, and notably Ukraine. Washington had lobbied against the vote with the accusation that 5,000 Cubans are currently fighting alongside Russian forces in Ukraine. Kyiv announced this morning that it was closing its embassy in Havana. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha explained that thousands of them had signed contracts and are fighting against Ukraine. Cuba's silence makes it complicit in the aggression. He also added that Cuba's president had publicly wished Putin's success in the war. We're not acting against the Cuban people, but against those who assist the killers. Ukraine will always defend the goals and principles of the UN Charter. It's worth noting here that there are rumours that Washington insisted Ukraine take that stance, and for obvious political reasons, Ukraine obliged. And that's where we are with the major political updates of the day, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Adélie. Beep, 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 beep. This is Huddersfield calling. It's time to welcome back James Kilner to the podcast for his regular deep dives into stories inside Russia. James, another big week. Where do you want to start for us?
I think top of the agenda, Francis, is the Kremlin is finally reacting to these very successful drone strikes that Ukraine's been using to target basically oil refinery capacity in Russia and some other critical infrastructure. So at the beginning of the week, Russian parliament passed a law which allowed reservists to be deployed around Russia to guard, specifically to guard so-called critical infrastructure. Putin set up a reserve army from 2015, a year after his initial invasion of Ukraine when he captured Crimea and parts of the Donbass region. Roughly has about 2 million reservists in it. We're already seeing them deployed across Russia or in some parts of Russia to defend these oil refineries from drone attacks. From what I can understand from the Russian media, they've been organized at a local, regional level rather than a Kremlin level. But a very clear Kremlin reaction to what has been a very successful strategy by Ukraine to go after the oil refining capacity.
Thanks, James. Just since you mentioned drones there, I know that we were talking this morning about a piece in The Telegraph that shows Russia is developing toys based off drones. Can you tell us about this?
Russian online retailers, the sort of Russian equivalent of Amazon, have been marketing these Serhii drones as toys. Serhii drones are the ones from Iran terrorizing Ukrainian cities for 3 years now. They've been made into toys fixed with what I understand to be a little firecracker explosive. So they shut the drone or you power them. And then when they hit a wall or when they hit the ground, there's a small explosion. So a really cynical toy, this, a really dark sort of insight into Russian society. The wider context here, Francis, as we know, as we discussed on your podcast many times, is the intensified militarization of Russian society and how every single strata of society, including children, are being targeted. Children are sort of being trained in how to use knives, how to use guns at a very basic level, how to spot drones. So this is happening at school. They're being indoctrinated. These Serhii drones is another very sick variant of this militarization of Russian society.
Thanks, James. Well, we'll link to that piece in the show notes. Let's go into the next story then. As we've been reporting on the podcast, Putin's been doing what he always does, a nuclear saber rattling with new missiles being shown off early this week and over the weekend. What's the Russian media coverage been of it, though, like, James?
So, yeah, this seems to be classic Putin, doesn't it? Whenever he gets irritated, annoyed, he brings out yet another, missile, which is impossible to shoot down. We've seen him do this time and again, and he seems to be deeply irritated by talk of Ukraine getting hold of Tomahawk missiles and the sanctions, the US sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, which we'll talk about a bit later. So he's responded with, in type with these two missiles, one surface launch missile and one underwater drone. The interesting thing about here is he's issued these two missiles in very close succession, I think only 3 days apart. The Russian media has been covering this heavily. As we keep discussing on your podcast, the Russian media lean heavily on the Kremlin for their leads. So the Kremlin's clearly told them to push it all out, to show Russia as a strong country with the top technology. Importantly, we had Putin on Sunday in military uniform talking about this nuclear-powered missile that was fired from the Russian Arctic. Now, we know Putin only puts on military uniform very occasionally. I think only 3, maybe 4 times since the start of his invasion of Ukraine. And that, I think, really signals to the Russian public that he's still very much focused on the military side of things in the war in Ukraine. The talks with the US have fallen through, and he's back now focusing on the military. Of course, the Russian media has been playing this up heavily, been talking about these two new cutting-edge missiles, Putin's comments about how they're possible to shoot down, and how also this sort of nuclear-powered, not just nuclear-capable missile, nuclear-powered missile, the technology can be transferred to civilian use, he claims. Anyway, Putin's talking about this to help open up the Arctic, pushing this Putin, the warrior. We talked about Putin, the peacemaker, but now he's wheeling out his warrior image. The Kremlin and its propagandists have been heavily pushing it through the week.
Thanks, James. Well, Adélie was just talking about Trump and his trip to Asia. This is something pretty unusual, isn't it? And I know that obviously Central Asia is your backyard, as it were, in terms of your expertise. I just wanted, before we go into the subject of protests inside Russia, what your perspective is on this trip and what Trump and Washington is seeking to get out of it and what the ramifications might be for the Kremlin.
As I understand it, Francis, and the details are still emerging, the White House has invited the 5 Central Asian leaders, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, to Washington next week. This is, to my mind, a complete first-time novelty that this has happened. It seems very clear to me that the White House has identified Central Asia as a potential weakness in the Russian sort of greater hegemony and wants to make progress. It comes after Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, the two presidents, were actually making major business deals with Boeing and US train manufacturers, several $1 billion deals. Trump uses business as a major tool for his foreign policy. He likes countries which buy US goods. Uzbekistan has also been very amenable to the US in taking back so-called illegal Uzbek migrants who found their way into the US, again, pleasing Trump. So I think what we have here is a very clear indication that the US is trying to charm these 5 former Soviet states. It also comes in the context of lack of talks between the US and Russia. I don't think Trump would be doing this if he'd made progress with Putin in these talks, but now those talks have fallen through. He's pressuring Russia each way and every way. And the Central Asian states, which are, they're natural allies really for the Kremlin and Russia. But, they've started wavering a bit, as have the Russian allies in the South Caucasus. We'll see where that develops. I do think it's really important. No US president has ever visited Central Asia. No US administration, as far as I'm aware, has taken so much interest in Central Asia, other than around the war in Afghanistan, where the US basically used Uzbekistan particularly, and other countries less so, airbase outside Bishkek, as a launch pad for its forces in Afghanistan. But actually, as Central Asian leaders, this is a remarkable juncture.
Thanks. Now, we've talked about the foreign agents law in the context of Georgia and Moldova before, but of course there is a foreign agents law in Russia, and you've been looking into an update on the ramifications of that for citizens, James.
2 or 3 weeks ago, I was on your podcast. I was talking about the arrest of an 18-year-old street singer called Diana Logineva. She'd been arrested for singing a song which was banned, referencing Swan Lake as sort of an image of chaos in Russia and the Soviet Union. She was thrown in prison. She was fined. She was thrown in prison for 13 days, etc. She was immediately rearrested, actually, when she'd done her 13 days in prison. Expected to be rearrested again, etc. This has triggered what appears to be something of a wildcat protest movement, for want of a better terminology. And I've got to say, we're talking about Russia here, so it's all very limited. Amongst other street performers and young people in Russia who've been using TikTok to post videos in support of Logineva, videos of them singing this song in the safety of their own home, or maybe just sort of humming it to themselves down the street, that sort of thing. The context is, obviously, protest in Russia is very hard to do. It's basically banned. This could be seen as anti-Kremlin. It's very dangerous, etc. So even that small share of resistance is interesting and should be monitored. There's another protest story I want to highlight to your listeners, Francis, in Vladivostok. That's Far East Russia. It must have been the beginning of October. When I was previously on your podcast, I was talking about how the authorities in Vladivostok had permitted a protest about a new tax being imposed on second-hand cars being imported into Russia from the beginning of November. The Kremlin, as we know, is desperate for cash. It decided that this was a good way of raising it. This permitted protest apparently attracted about 500 people, which is relatively large. And as I reported 2 or 3 weeks ago on your podcast, some of the placards, some of the slogans being shouted around and waved around were actually very clearly anti-Kremlin. Not anti-war, but anti-Kremlin, and about the Kremlin stance on this particular tax. Now, it seems, as I understand, as I've been reading across the Russian media, organisers of that protest applied once again to the Vladivostok authorities to get permission to stage another protest on November the 6th. That has actually been refused, and instead the authorities have given permission for a pro-Kremlin protest to happen, a state-managed protest. It shows the psychopathy of the Kremlin. They were clearly irritated. They clearly decided there'd been a misstep around the initial protest, and so they just stop any more protests. What it does mean, again, is that these little sort of embers of frustration that we see in Russia popping up on our radar, and it's very important to spot them as soon as they're up because they get smashed down straight away. There's no release valve for them. You know, this links heavily onto the state of the Russian economy, etc. Definitely worth your listeners keeping an eye on.
And I know there was one other story, James, relating to protests, this time about the foreign agents law.
Absolutely correct. So the foreign agents law is something I've been talking about on this podcast, reported how Putin has signed into law, making it quicker and easier for the authorities to slap this foreign agents tag on troublesome people. And now they seem to have gone a bit further. Foreign agents, basically, if you're labelled with a foreign agent, it's basically a stigma. It's more difficult to get jobs. It's more difficult to open bank accounts. There's been a new law passed at the end of last week, which is going to make foreign agents pay more tax as well. You have to consider that maybe they're messing around with this law. Maybe they're making it more draconian and more hardcore because they understand people are getting tired of the war. They understand people are getting tired of the economic conditions in Russia. And maybe they're anticipating more protests. So they're generally making it easier for people to be labelled foreign agent, and they're making the conditions that people have to labour under once they earn this stigma harder as well.
Thanks for that, James. Well, we come to the biggie then, which is, of course, the Russian economy, a favourite subject of yours. And there have been developments in the last couple of weeks on this. Of course, Adélie was talking about them earlier on, particularly those sanctions that the Americans have put on. What kind of impacts and reactions are we seeing in the Russian press to this, James?
Yeah, I guess it is something of a favourite subject. It's certainly a very important subject to keep on top of. I mean, clearly the Russian press is trying to play this down as much as possible. One of the reasons I look so closely at the economy, Francis, is that the economic reporting is a bit more liberal than the political mainstream reporting. They have more flexibility. So even in the Kremlin media, they've been reporting about how these US sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft are going to have a sort of serious, in quotation mark, economic impact, and that Lukoil was going to have to sell its overseas assets. Just before we started our podcast today, news came through that Lukoil has indeed just sealed a deal to sell its overseas assets to a trading company, sort of Swiss-based, but registered in Cyprus, I think. It's the Gunvor trading company, which was set up by a Russian billionaire ally of Putin, funnily enough, Gennady Timchenko, who is now officially not a stakeholder since 2014. He hasn't been an official stakeholder of Gunvor. This is a trading company which is well linked and well known to have very strong Russia ties. It claims, I have to be careful what I say, not Russia ties. It claims it doesn't have any Russia assets under its ownership, etc., or linked to the Kremlin. But it has now bought Lukoil's overseas assets. It's not clear that there's been no number put on the deal. It's not clear whether this is all the assets or just the massive chain of petrol stations. Lukoil owns huge oil field investments in Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. Will it have to sell those as well, also in Iraq? We just don't know. But that is a huge impact. There's no doubt about it, I think, that the Russian prestige, economic prestige overseas, has been impacted by these US sanctions, and the decision by Lukoil. Lukoil is Russia's second largest oil company, so economic asset for the Kremlin. Kremlin's going to earn less cash from Lukoil now going forward. More news on the economic front. Russia on Friday cut its core interest rate to 16.5% from 17%. We started the year at 22%. And the central bank in Russia has been under huge pressure from business to cut its interest rates. This sort of cut was basically expected, but in amongst the decision to cut interest rates, the central bank actually said for the first time, inflation is likely to rise. It's sort of likely to accelerate faster than they expected. Analysts have already been talking about this, but to get this sort of admission from the central bank is important. A lot of the rise to raise extra cash for its armies in Ukraine. The Kremlin has slapped on another, it's increased the VAT from 20% to 22%. That's happening on January the 1st. There's a spending spree or something of a spending spree going on now. And then all the prices will rise with VAT. So that's an accelerator for inflation. But we generally know that the central bank and the Kremlin is terrified of inflation. Russia's already having a very tough time economically. As we've reported over the last 3 years, France's, staple goods spike suddenly in prices and cause the Kremlin major headache. So very interesting, important statement there from the central bank around its interest rate cut. The last item on the economic segment of what's going on in Russia, it caught me very much by surprise. This again has been in the mainstream Kremlin propagandist media. This happened on Monday and Tuesday. MPs have been apparently discussing the benefits of a 4-day week in Russia, and perhaps this should be nationwide, or certainly talking about Russian companies reducing the amount of hours that workers have to work each week. They've been dressing this up as sort of progressive worker initiative, and isn't it a good thing? Isn't it a modern thing? But in reality, this seems to be a cover, fig leaf, for major Russian businesses, major industries running out of orders and shifting their workforce to a 4-day week just to survive. So, it's like the Kremlin and its propagandists are trying to normalize the concept of 4-day week through MPs and Parliament discussing it. It's almost like a crisis management propaganda, operation. Very interesting to see being talked about and discussed in the mainstream Russian media.
Thanks very much, James. We'll come back to you for your final thought in a moment. But just a quick one from me first. With Dom off until tomorrow, I'm writing our newsletter solo this week. One of the questions I'll be answering is from Christian in Austria, who writes, why do we still talk about a ceasefire when it comes to the strategy and how to help Ukraine? Why don't we talk about a strategy to defeat Russia in Europe? With Nazi Germany, we didn't talk about ceasefires. It needed to be defeated. Well, I look forward to getting my teeth stuck into that one. We've also had a cunning plan here. Rather than just asking you to send in written questions for the newsletter, we'll soon invite you to send short voice clips, about 20 seconds long, introducing yourself with your first name, where you're from, followed by your question. Then each week, we'll pick 2 or 3 to play on the podcast as a way of highlighting the questions we'll be answering in the newsletter. So if you want to get ahead of the curve, feel free to send them in to our usual address. I really look forward to listening to some of those. That address is, of course, ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. Just as a reminder, if you're not subscribed to the newsletter, it's completely free. It features maps of the front lines, which I know many of you find helpful when placing the updates in the military realm, and as well, what we're reading each week. In my case, the past fortnight, novels about cats and Cold War history. The dream combo. I've just posted on X a pile of books that are on my mind at the moment. So do sign up. There's a link in the show notes. It offers another avenue to stay connected. But Adélie, where do you want to leave listeners today?
Thanks, Francis. I just want to mention a story from France that I'll be following closely and that I will talk at more length in the future, but I just wanted to mention it for a start. It's very well reported by Politico Paris. Listeners may remember that several incidents over the last few years that have all been linked to foreign agents and Russian interference. There has been vandalism at the Holocaust Memorial in Paris, red hands painted on the wall of the righteous, also pigs' heads drenched in blood that were sent to a Paris mosque in the early hours of the morning, coffins appearing under the Eiffel Tower at the beginning of the Olympics, or Stars of David spray painted onto buildings, or again, paint splashed on a famous restaurant in one of Paris's historic Jewish neighborhood. Now, I think you're getting the common theme here. They're all designed to inflame tensions between France's Jewish and Muslim communities and play on France's deep social, economic, cultural, religious, political divisions, all very fertile ground for Kremlin interference. Well, there's a trial that opened yesterday in Paris involving 4 men that are accused of the defacement of the Holocaust Memorial. They were fleeing to Sofia and arrested by the Bulgarian authorities. And There is suspicion that they may have acted, knowingly or not, as Russian agents. In the other incidents I've mentioned, there have been citizens of Serbia that have been arrested, also identified with potential ties to Russia. So it's a really interesting story, I think, that has been going on for a long time, that says a lot about France and where it stands in the war and where the French public stands in the war and how it is indeed, as the article says, fertile ground for the Kremlin to get its teeth stuck into, and how that's going to play out in the elections in 2027. That will be something we'll be closely monitoring.
Thanks very much, Adélie. A fascinating story. And as you say, one that speaks to many of the common themes that we've been talking about, not only in today's episode, but in episodes the last few months. But James, as our guest, where would you like to leave listeners today? You've got the final word.
More of a curious item that I spotted. This is from the 17th Congress of the Russian Geographical Society. They had their annual Congress last week, I think it was. Putin was there giving a speech. And in the crowd were a whole load of women who are wearing these traditional Russian tiaras, these kokoshniks, ornate, often made out of fabric affairs. And the reason this was important, Francis, is because earlier this month, Putin himself at the Valdai conference, which is an annual meeting of analysts invited to Russia, etc., Putin himself had said how he had heard that Russian women were starting to wear these kokoshniks to go to bars and restaurants, etc., and how wonderful it was that they were representing traditional Russian values. I think this is just one of those little indicators, there's little tactics that the Kremlin is using to try and, once again, separate traditional family values, as I like to call it, from the indulgent West. And it's now pushing the kokoshnik tiara as one of these indicators.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.